But I appreciate you being with us. And, from my vantage point, I kind of get to see things across North America just because of working with the North American Mission Board. And I continue to be really encouraged with the adaptability of pastors and churches to continue to do ministry through the midst of all of this. I'm also very much aware of the frustration and the stress and the wear on pastors and churches. It's very real, and it's not really getting any better. It's maybe sometimes getting a little more raw, even as we kind of try to figure out what level to kind of be at in terms of protection and all of that. So I'm not suggesting in any way I see it getting any easier, any better. I'm just suggesting I've been really impressed with the way pastors and churches have continued to battle through it, haven't just laid down. Rayner talks about, Rayner and Barner, 1 in 5 churches aren't going to come back after COVID. That's all denominations. There are some Southern Baptist churches that may not come back after it, but those are the ones that were at the point of closure anyway. This probably just sped up the process a little bit. But I think even, you can look in your own association, just even all the churches there are really trying to do whatever they can week to week, day to day, Sunday to Sunday, to meet as many needs as they can and keep things going. And that's just been really encouraging. The tenacity of the local church has been really, really encouraging through all this. Because there's a lot of people that have written off the local church as, completely, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but there's some writers and speakers and things that have basically said that, the local church is pointless and dead and we got to do it all different. And yet it's pretty tough, it's still there and still plugging along and still doing their thing. So that's been really encouraging. So as we look at this book, Flickering Lamps, obviously it's because Christ is with his church. He's with his church in all kinds of times, including during COVID. He hasn't left us. And I do believe when we look back on this, those of you who are younger than me, and you look back on it decades from now, the rest of us who maybe look back on it a few years from now, it will be a time when we will be able to see where Christ was with his church in a very real and specific way. And I think what feels right now sometimes like incredible oppression and struggle and difficulty, and understandably so, on the other side of it, I think we will see and understand, man, God was really with us through that. How did we navigate that? How did we go that many months without meeting publicly? How did we go another several months with only a few of our people meeting? How did we go where we couldn't do our children's ministry and everything else, and yet we continued? And I really think what Satan means for evil, God's really going to use for his glory and for good, to help remind us that Christ is with his church. And this chapter that we're looking at today is critically important, Christ's provision for his church. I wish, I know if you've been in denominational life or associational life for very long, prior to COVID, sometimes you'd meet with a church that was struggling in terms of attendance, in terms of reaching people, and you could look at it and realize, man, they don't have much longer to go. And yet they had money in the bank, sometimes significant money in different accounts. A lot of times they'd have them in, an account for a family life center that they're never going to build, or an account for an organ that they don't need anymore, and different things like that. But they end up, I've been to churches where they would end up having, significant money in CDs and no people and no reach, not reaching anybody. And so when you start talking about, well, maybe you need to fix up the building, maybe you need to fix up the children's area, maybe you need to look at doing some ministry in the community, maybe even look at for a few years, instead of being bivocational, you've got enough funds in your CDs that you could pay a pastor for a few years if we help find the right pastor. Invariably, they would say something like, well, but that's in case something happens. What if we have a bad, up here in Missouri or up in Nebraska, what if we have a bad winter and we have 3 or 4 Sundays we can't have church? That was always the thing. And we can't take offerings, or what if? Well, you know what? All those what ifs have happened and we're still around. And so I think to some degree, hopefully when we come out of this, we will realize that Christ provides for his church, even when his church can't meet. And I don't know what it's going to end up eventually, but obviously the cooperative program, again, I'm talking from a national standpoint, the cooperative program really isn't down that much, and it's real early in the process for us. But Annie Armstrong, when you imagine that we weren't even meeting in those months, is still doing relatively well considering that. And then most associations I talk to are still doing okay. And most churches we talk to are doing all right. And so it's just cool to see it now. And I want us to be really careful about this. Really, really careful, guys. If your church financially right now is doing all right, you're not, you want to be careful about commending the members. I realize their faithfulness in giving is important. And I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm about three paragraphs into my thing today, but I realize that their commitment to continue to give during COVID, some of them who don't even attend because of health matters, and send their check in or give online, and the giving has stayed up there for many churches. I realize our first inclination is to be grateful to our members. A better way to do that is to be grateful for God to provide faithful members and make sure that we are giving credit where it is due. It's not our members who are supporting the church. It is Christ who's supporting his church through the faithful gifts of loving members. And so that's not a small difference when you communicate it, because otherwise it looks like our people are doing it, which means I'm doing it. It's my gifts is keeping the church going. And we don't want that attitude, because that's not true. It is Christ who gets the church. It's Christ, as we know, he's the one that provides you the ability to have the money to give to the church. So it's all him anyway. And so to use this time when you say, man, I realize I've heard so many pastors say, I'm so grateful for the faithfulness of our people in this time. That's true. But you need to say, I'm grateful for the faithfulness of Jesus to provide for his church in this time. Let them see that Jesus is the one that's doing this. He's doing it through these people. In fact, you've heard me say before, I know I've said it a lot, when you're even praying for the offering on Sunday morning, and you thank you, God, for the gifts and the givers. That's as if anybody ever hears that anymore. We say it so often. But I think to say something like, Lord, thank you for providing to your church through these, your generous servants. So it's always Jesus who's providing, not the people. So we don't get that sense of entitlement. All right. So in the time of COVID, what a great time to talk about God provides for his church. And you've heard me say, because, Richard and Henry have said it, and it's probably one of the most quoted things I've said is that, and because it makes sense, Jesus is under no obligation, nor will he provide to resource your plans for his church. And so a lot of the times the reason we don't see the provision of Christ in our churches is because we want him to provide for our plans, what we would like the church to be, what we would like to do, the things we would like to see. And it's not that those things that we would like to see are bad or incorrect or unbiblical. They're just not what Christ wants for his church. And we have to go back and begin at the very beginning, as we did in this whole study, that Jesus has a plan for every church. And our first and primary calling is to help our members and us as leaders discover what is God's plan for our church. Because he is under no obligation, nor will he likely fully resource at all your plans for his church. And that's where we get into trouble. And I've heard Henry say on many occasions, if your church is unable to do things and you have no financial ability, and the roof is leaking, you can't fix it, and the parking lot's a mess and it can't be fixed, and you can't pay your bills, I'm not sure I can actually bring myself to say this to people, but I've heard Henry say it years ago. If the resources aren't coming in, then you really have to explore and well, he would just say, you're not following Jesus' plan for his church, because Jesus will always resource his plan. He'll never resource your plan, but he'll always resource his plan. And so sometimes when the finances are a mess and you don't have any resources, rather than to just sort of hit the panic button and run out and say, we need help from somebody, is to say, wait a minute, why are we not receiving what we need? Maybe we're not doing what we should be doing. And that's a hard question, but it's a real one. And I think it's legit, and I think it's right spot on, because he will. Can you imagine? Look, I know it's Monday morning, and we've been a busy week last week and a short week because of Labor Day, and we got a lot to go this week. But just think with me for a minute. I mean, come on. We've been pastors for a long time. We really think Jesus isn't able to resource whatever he wants to do in your church? That somehow or another his hands are tied because, I don't know, just the church down the street won't help, or the association can't help us, or the state convention can't help us. So, I mean, what can Jesus do? I mean, it's just ridiculous. We know that. So if we're not receiving what we need, we have to go back and say, we look at it and say, we're not doing what we should be doing. Now, with that said, all right, sometimes he wants us to serve him in the midst of poverty and trust him day to day. I'm not telling you he opens the windows of heaven and gives you everything you want and gives you extra. You know, you look, but I'm not talking about that. In fact, as you've heard me say before, Lyle Schaller has said, you know, extra money in the bank is often the death wheeze of a church because you trust yourself and not the Lord. And if you read the story of Faith Baptist in Saskatoon, it's not that that church became wealthy. In fact, you know, they barely made it in terms of from a human standpoint, but from a divine standpoint, they never went without anything. All right. So I'm not talking about you get everything you want. You have extra, you have more abundance. You can fill your barns. I'm talking about when it needed, when it has to come, he provides it. And you live literally by faith, literally by walking on the water at the voice of Jesus and trusting him, because if you trust in anything else, you're going to go under. Being in that kind of place. And frankly, many people would rather stay in the boat and hang on to the side of the boat than to listen to the Lord and get out and walk on the water and do only what works. But if you live by faith like that, he'll give you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. God does provide finances. Here's what he says in this. If you've got it's a great quote from page 98. God does not need to provide any resource for what you are not doing. That's worth getting up for this morning. God does not need to provide any resource for what you are not doing. That could be the whole chapter, all right? How many times have I heard pastors, you know, want things, money, resources, and they're not doing those things anyway? They're not going door to door. They're not reaching people. They're not making disciples. They're not sharing their home with people. They're not having Bible studies in their home. They're not opening their church building and letting community members use it for various things. They're not doing any of that stuff, but they still want God to provide resources before they start doing something like that. And I just think that's a powerful statement. And I'm probably going to start quoting it a whole bunch more. God does not need to provide any resource. He does not need to provide any resource for something you are not doing. Many people say, well, as soon as we've collected the funds we need, we will obey. But they're not acting in faith. Just as God did not stop the waters of the Jordan until the priest's feet dipped into the water, so God often waits until we start marching before he provides the resources. And brothers and sisters, that is why we often don't experience God's provision. We just look at that river and we go, we can't cross it. Until he stops it, we're not moving. Until we got the money, we're not doing it. I work with replanting churches. And there are two, a lot of times there are two entities here. You have the church that is seeking to be adopted and the church doing the adoption. Let me tell you what happens oftentimes. It starts out with the church that is seeking to adopt is usually that they're the, I don't want to use the word the aggressor, but they're the pursuer. That's the word. They're the pursuer. They're pursuing this this church. They want to adopt it. They see it. They understand the opportunity. They're excited about it. So generally speaking, in these, and I deal with them every week, hundreds of them in the last 2 years. Generally speaking, it is the church that wants to adopt that is the one that is initially the pursuer. They're the ones trying to get this done. They're the ones to they're the proactive ones. And it's the church that's going to be adopted that is very resistant. All these reasons it can't be done, everything we're going to have to give up, change our name, lose the fact that we have deacons, our Sunday school teachers may change. We're not going to be able to control, the whole thing. So it's very typical. Start out with this group who's pursuing. It's sort of like some guy that's trying to take a girl to the prom, and he really wants to take her, and she's not real certain about it, or something like that. It's kind of that kind of thing. That's way bad. That's not a good analogy. But there's a pursuer in the relationship, and it's generally the church that wants to adopt. Oftentimes, somewhere in this little thing that goes on, it begins to change a little bit. And just about the time the adopting church goes, you know what? We are at a point where we really do think this is what God wants, and we're willing to lay it all down and walk away. It's oftentimes, Chris, at that time, the church is going to be adopted and go, well, that roof is going to need to be replaced, and those air conditioners are going to go out in about 4 or 5 years. And, man, that's a lot of building to take care of. And, it's going to be a lot of money. And it's invariably, there's this sort of thing of like, where are we going to find the money to do that at that point? And it sort of, the dynamic changes a little bit. Now, fortunately, most of the time, the church is doing adoption. They kind of go through that process and they go, okay, but you know what? We're still going to trust the Lord for this, and they move on in faith. But they have sort of a crisis of belief when they realize they've actually caught the one they want to catch, and they realize, oh, there's a lot of expense here maybe we didn't fully see before. And in that regard, it's really important at that point that they realize, no, you may not have the money to fix that roof right now. You may not have the money to fix all those air conditioners right now. But you know what? 6 months from now, when that roof needs to be fixed, or 2 years from now, when those air conditioners go out, God can provide it then. He doesn't have to give it to you today in the bank before you take this adoption. You can trust him, because you know what? He's pretty worthy of it. And most of the time they get there. Now, let me give you another really good example of that. We had our summit, our replant summit here a couple of weeks ago. And we had it at a church called Greenwood. And this is a church I told you about before that had split, and then the split. That's always a good thing. When you split the church to about half the size, and then the remaining people decide that wasn't enough trauma in the life of people, so we'll split again. It worked so good the first time, why not do it again? So they split a second time. And so they were down to a really fraction of folks. But then it really became tragic in that their youth pastor began to physically, sexually abuse young boys, and was arrested and is in jail to this day. So when you have a church that's split and then split again, and then you had a youth pastor, and even though this is Metro Kansas City, there's a few miles between Greenwood and Lee Summit, the next major suburb. And so Greenwood's a town that's older than Kansas City, or as old. It's a little town of about 1,200 people. So you can imagine, First Baptist Church splits again, and then the youth minister gets arrested, right? I mean, come on, who's going to touch that thing with a 10-foot pole? Well, what happens, there is a church, Lenexa Baptist, which is 40 miles away in one of the best, most fastest growing parts of Kansas City. And Lenexa is about 4,000 people a weekend. But Steve Dighton, the pastor at Lenexa, just had a compassion for Greenwood Church. So Steve took it to his deacons and said, look, nobody had ever done this. It was 8 years ago. We weren't ready to replanting back then. Steve and I had lunch one day. He asked about the possibility of this. I thought it was, really cool, worth pursuing. So he went to his deacons and he said, look, this church is about to go under. This town needs a church. That part of Kansas City is rapidly growing, and it was. He said, I think we need to just take them on as a mission. Just take them over. And, Steve was the only pastor that church had ever had. He basically started the church. So he grew it to 4,000 a weekend in 20 plus years. And the deacons loved him and he loved them and trusted them. And basically they never, turned him down on anything that he felt like God wanted him to do. They turned him down on this. It was pretty abrupt. Like, no, we're going to vote against this. And we're not taking on this liability on the other side of the city. No reason to do that. Everything's going great right here. And Steve just really felt in his heart, if you ever heard Steve tell the story, he felt in his heart strong as he had anything in his entire ministry. This is something God really wanted him and this church to do. So he gathered the leadership of the deacons together again. He said, I don't think you understand. I'm not talking about just wanting to do a project. I really feel this is can we spend some time as deacons? You really didn't even spend time praying about this. So they spent several weeks together praying it over, and sure enough, they began to see like this was God's movement, and so they voted again and voted to recommend they do it. So they took it over. As it turns out, God was all over it, and the church just grew significantly, more bigger than most replants. It's an anomaly. So it's about 1,000 a weekend now, and it has replanted other churches. Hope you're still with me because the story gets good here, all right? Gets really good. So my son and his wife go to one of the replants that Greenwood has done called Raymore Church, and they love it. So Raymore was going down the tubes fast, and Greenwood took them over, and they're doing great. My sons love it. My son and his family love it. They have a wonderful little pastor. I shouldn't say little pastor. That's terrible. Wonderful young man named Alan Finley, who's the pastor over at Raymore, where my kids go. Well, years ago, Alan sent me a message and said, hey, when he was in seminary, I read your book and I want to be a replanter. And so I connected some with Alan, but I'd lost contact with him. And next thing I know, he's pastoring my son's church that Greenwood hired him as the replant pastor at Raymore. And actually he moved 3 doors down from my son. They live on the same street. And he's got a little girl that's about 4, and my grandson's 4, and they play together all the time. And so it's really cool, So I'm over at the Replant Summit. Don't lose me here. This is really good. So I'm over at the Replant Summit, and we got all the program done, and everybody's up there speaking they're supposed to. But I look out there, and Alan is sitting in the congregation, and he's not on the program. So during one of the parts of the program, I come up and I say, hey, look, I know this isn't on the program, but Alan, and you don't know I'm going to do this, but Alan, come on up here. I said, Alan, Alan's my son's pastor, and his pastor in a replant at Raymore. And Alan's, he was interested in replanting when he was in seminary and sent me a note and said he was interested in replanting. Now he's my son's pastor. So Alan, why don't you just tell him how that happened? That's all I knew, right? So Alan gets up there and he's at Greenwood. This is where we're having the conference. All right. He's at Greenwood. Stay with me. And right to his left off the platform is the baptistry at Greenwood. And so Alan gets up there and he says, I was baptized in this baptistry right over here as a middle school boy. And he said, I was one of the boys that the youth minister molested. And I'm not sure he said molested. He said, I was one of the boys that was here when the youth minister molested boys. I want to be careful about that. He said, I'm not sure exactly that's what he said. He said that. And he said, and I was affected by that. He did say that. And he said, but Lenexa showed up. And when Lenexa showed up, everything changed. And, you sit there and you think, well, why did Steve Dighton feel so passionate that they need to take over this totally broken church where they'd had a youth minister that had molested some boys? And then you realize there was a lot at stake. Young Alan. And Alan said, basically, he said, and all of us who experienced that, God's grace has been made known, and we're all doing well. And they're doing well because at that critical moment in the life of these middle school boys, Lenexa showed up. And literally overnight, that became a healthy place and a place where people were loved and cared for. And it became a healthy church that really helped those boys heal, so much so that Alan became a pastor, and now he's my son's pastor. So God provides. And if Lenexa had said, well, there's two, and the thing Lenexa was most concerned about, obviously, was what? It was lawsuits, right? If we take over that church, there's all kind of lawsuits that are going to come our way. Well, it all worked out. There weren't any lawsuits that came their way. But they had to understand that they had to come to the place where they truly believed God would provide if those things happened. And when they stepped out in that faith and believed that God's provision was there, the church not only grew, and we get lost in those numbers sometimes, but the reality that this young man who had experienced, or at least his friends had, in some way or another, had been affected by all that was going on with those boys, was rescued by Lenexa. I just think that's critically important. So God's not going to help you fund what you're not already doing, but he will provide for his plans for your church. And I'll talk a little more about that financial in a minute, but he will provide financially. Secondly, Henry and Richard point out that he will provide leaders. And again, what are the two things all of us need? We need money, we need leaders. And we talk about that all the time. And unfortunately, I think sometimes when we talk about leaders, we're just looking for sort of ready-made people who come to us that can start plugging in and working right away. And the leaders he talks about here, clearly God will provide a pastor, but God will provide other types of leaders in your church that you need. And that is very much going to be a part of you reaching out and finding people to lead to Christ and to disciple and to grow them. Look at the long run on leadership, not the short run. We're always looking for that short answer. If God had provided someone to work with children, someone to work with youth, and I realize the great need we have in that. But Richard and Henry are quite right in that God's time frame's not our time frame. And so very often what we want are leaders immediately, but what he wants us to do is to develop the leaders that we already have. Sometimes we have to look outside to have people that help us initially, but the leadership, and how many times have you said this, the resources are in the harvest. They truly are. And so God will provide that harvest, and he will provide those leaderships. God will provide a shepherd. He really will. And so he says here about that, if churches are going to recognize their provision, the God's provision for them, there are several things they must understand. God's not restricted by your size. Just because you're small doesn't mean he's not going to provide the leaders. Second one, he said, I've witnessed churches the second assumption I have is that churches believe that God's provision for a pastor is limited to their financial resources. It's amazing how God can provide the pastor you need regardless of the financial resources your church has. And he talks here about many examples of that. And again, there's a faith component to it. And I realize it's incredibly risky, and it seems sometimes even sort of unwise sometimes for pastors to come and not have all the finances in place. But if God's really called you to be there and really called that to happen, I got personal experience with this, guys. Well, my father, this was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, believe it or not. And my dad, there was a church in Independence, and we were living in a county seat town up in North Missouri, and everything was fine. I mean, we loved the town loved us. My dad's church had tripled in size, running about 400. And there was this broken down church in Independence, Missouri, in Kansas City, Metro Kansas City. My mom and dad had never lived in anything remotely like a city. And so the idea that we would move from a small county seat town to the city, to a church that was 100 people, that was sinking like a rock. I mean, the executive
director of the Missouri Baptist Convention called my dad and said, "Harry, don't go there. There's no reason for you to go to that church." But we went down and preached, and the church looked really sad, and the building looked really bad. And they showed us the parsonage, and it didn't look much better. And it was right next door to the church, which just thrilled my mother to no end that we were going to basically share a parking lot with the church. I'm being facetious about that. And I did. I grew up sharing a parking lot with the church. So everybody knew when we went to bed, when we got up, and if my bike was left out and everything else. So, but when we went down there, it was 1970. And I don't know, my dad was making somewhere around, I think, $250 a week up in Chillicothe. I remember him telling me this many times, and lived in a parsonage, and came to Independence for $125 a week for half of that. And living in Kansas City was a lot more expensive than living in rural North Missouri. We didn't have farmers bringing whole hogs over to us and stuff like that. And it was hard on my dad. In fact, I didn't know how hard it was until later in ministry when he told me about it. Didn't have any health insurance, didn't have any life insurance, you know. But at the end of the day, guys, can I just tell you, he stayed there almost 30 years. The church grew to about 400 or 500. And near the end of his ministry, the church did a Together We Build, and they built a second story on the education building, paid for it, and they had money left over. And they gave it to my dad, a pretty good size of it, for a down payment on a house, so that when he retired, he could have a house. And when he retired, they gave him a brand new car. Now, you can make out what you want out of that. But I'm telling you, if you thought about it, you wouldn't move your family to a town. You wouldn't have done that. And so when I read this, I see it. Now, don't be an idiot. Don't go somewhere God's not telling you to go. I mean, you know, Jesus didn't tell John and James to get out of the boat. So they stayed where they stayed for a good reason. But he told Peter to get out of the boat. So if he tells you to get out of the boat, you go. And that, again, is why this whole book is prefaced not on your wisdom, but on your understanding of what God is saying to you. And I got to tell you, I'm not sure I would have been at the place spiritually that my dad was, that I could have discerned that and realized I'm going to risk everything and move my family and take half the income and not have, I'm not telling you not having health insurance is a smart thing. I'm not telling you not having life insurance is a smart thing. I'm not telling you that, but we did it. And same thing with Steve Dighton at Lenexa, taking a church that was blown and grown and the biggest church in the city, and go, hey, we're going to adopt this church over here, and we're going to take responsibility for maybe a whole mess of legal issues. You know, it doesn't make any sense. But in both of those cases, God provided. And I think the reason we don't see God providing is we sit back and we go, well, he's going to have to show me first how he's going to do it before I go. It ain't going to happen, guys. It is not going to happen. To use the scripture that Henry and Richard used in Joshua, he did not let the children of Israel set up on the hill while he built a bridge across the Jordan and said, now you can go. There had been no faith involved in that in whatsoever. So he provides for finances. He provides for leadership. And thirdly, he says God uses what's already in our hands. When he's talking about Moses and the staff, he said, well, what's in your hand? And he said, surrender it. Lay down that staff and let me show you. Just that regular staff, he can turn it into a snake and turn it back into a staff. And with that staff, he could strike rock and bring forth water. He could raise it and part the Red Sea. God used what's in his hands. And again, so many times we want God to give us something we don't already have when we're not even using what we already have. How are you using the building you already have? Are you letting the community use it? Are you opening it up to other people? Are you letting the community use your kitchen for their fellowship time? If you're not going to use what you already have, if you're not going to lay down your staff, God can't use it. He can't do those things. So God will use what's already in your hand. And he talks, number 4, about God provides for new ministries, which is true. He does things that we could never think or imagine. Churches are always finding ways right now to do something brand new. Look around you and say, where is something that's not being done? You may not have any children in your Sunday school class, right? And he talks about this in this book. But if you look in your community, is there any Sunday school classes or any activities for children in your community of special needs? What if you started a Sunday school class for special needs kids? Now, look, I know that's a huge deal during COVID. It'd be really impossible, but eventually, you know, and I've known churches that have done this. They'll find one or two sweet couples who have had special need kids or special need grandkids, have a special love for them. And you start a class just for special needs kids in your community. And you may not reach a large number, but the ones you really do reach are ones who really need it. And we could talk a lot about different things like that. But Henry and Richard make it abundantly clear that God will bring you provision to start brand new ministries if you'll look for things that really need to be done and needs that really need to be met. He wants to be there and help you meet those. So with all of that said, guys, I think I've shared this with you before, but when I've talked to you this many Mondays, I've shared everything I know before. Here's how I think when you talk about God's provision, here are three things, all right, that you can do. First of all, always give God credit for everything that is provided for your church. As I said when I started this at 8:30, be careful not to always acknowledge it's your people who provide, because that gives them a sense that they're doing it. But always acknowledge God is providing for his church through his people. And you thank God for the people who are faithful with what he's given them, but it's God who provides. So always communicate to your folks that God is the one that's providing for his church, and always give him gratitude for that. Every time you pray for the offering, anytime thing like that, help your people hear you say that God is providing. Secondly, when God does provide something, celebrate it and write it down and celebrate it again and remember it over and over and over. There came a time in the life of the church in Independence when my dad, years later, would share a little bit about that and how God had provided and how he'd used people in that were faithful to provide. And it became a real sort of marker in the life of that church that no matter what came up again, God had provided in the past and he would be able to provide in the future. So when he does provide like that, celebrate those stories, set them up as a marker, make them part of your church's history, retell those stories when you tell your church's history so they become very real and very meaningful to you. And thirdly, and this is really critically important, in many ways what we do, and even what I'm doing now at Little Linwood, we just came up with our first budget last week at Linwood, and we're having our first community activity this Friday night. We're going to show movies on an outdoor screen. Friday night and Saturday, we're going to go to every door in Linwood. We're going to hang a door hanger on every door in town. And so I have discovered lately that church has been there since 1911, and there are 400 people in town. And I have discovered lately in the last 110 years that church has managed to offend everybody in town at least twice. So it's yeah. Anyway, you know, and in a small town, like I've told you before, it's like it happened yesterday if it happened 40 years ago. So, yeah, we got a little work to overcome, but nonetheless, you know, there's a reason there were only 3 members left in that church. All right, it wasn't because it was the most loving, happy place in town. So we're going door to door, and we're going to do all that. So that's this week. So that's the first thing we've ever done like that. But we just started our budget. We put together a budget. All right, here's what you do. We have a budget that is what we kind of anticipate we're going to receive from the 12 or 14 members that we have right now. And maybe a little bit more because we'll grow. So sort of realistic. This is kind of what we got. And then we also look and say, okay, here's what it's going to cost for us to pay the utilities and pay the rent, send our money to missions, do a little bit of mission work here in town, have a little bit of money perhaps to help pay right now a worship person to come in and help us lead music. We're going to need that. And that's about it. So we look at what 12 or 14 members are given and we go, okay, that's about what we can do with that amount of money. But then what we do is, and that's okay. That's what we sort of that's our budget of what, but then we have something we call the God's budget. And in God's budget, we write out, well, here's what after we pray about it, think on it, really perceive what Lord would have us to do. what are the things, if money weren't really an object, what would God have us do in this town? And so one of the first things we said was, well, this building needs definite attention, right? So we've got to do something about the children's area. We got to do something about the greet area. We got to do something. We don't have the internet. We don't have anything like that. We're going to have to bring in some internet. So but we didn't put that in our other budget because we just don't have the money. So we put this and say, this is what this would be. And then we got the school right across the street, right? And so we say, well, we would like to be able to provide this stuff for the school every year, and these activities for the school every year, and this stuff for the teachers every year. And then our town is relatively low income. Well, we'd like to do some of these things, food distribution and things like that. So we list all those things. What we do is we put those over here and we say, this is the budget that we're really seeing that God will fund, and he will do it. Well, within the first couple of weeks, we had a church come to us and say, look, what are you doing about your building? And I said, well, it needs all kinds of help, but we don't know where to begin. And they said, well, there's a company that we've used before that comes in and they do all the measurements. We don't even have a set of plans for this building we're in. You know, it's been built over the last 100 years and it's been pieced together. There's no architectural drawings. So this company comes in and they'll use 3D computer stuff, and they go inside, take all the pictures outside, create these drawings of your church, and then they can tell you, because this is what they do, they can tell you the best way to reconfigure walls and space to get the best use out of your church for the 21st century rather than the 19th century. Restrooms, kitchen, children's area, they can do all that, and it gives you a master plan, and then they can show you how much you could do on your own, how much you might have to have some contractor. And I say, well, you know, how much is that going to be? Well, it's about $7,500. But this church said, you know what, we'll take care of that. So guess what? We don't just go, oh, well, that church is going to take care of that. We go, God's already funded that part of our budget. We had that written down that we wanted to do with the building. So this is God's already funded that part of that budget. And I'm telling you, that is the kind of thing that when we get through this year, all these things over on the right side that we said, these are the things we're going to trust God to fund. It may be an individual who gives a little extra money. It may be a church like that says we want to do this. It's kind of a pet project. It may be something else. I had another church tell me that they would rent the outdoor movie screen for us. So fine. We don't just say, hey, look, well, all these churches are helping us. This was what we said we wanted, and God would fund it. And look, God is funding it. And that creates a culture of faith so that you're willing to step out and take risk and know that if you're doing what God wants you to do, he'll fund it. I could just sum it all up. He will resource his plans for his church. So some of you need to come up with sort of two budgets. One of, yes, this is what we have to spend. But if we really trusted the Lord and he wanted us to do these things over here on this side, what budget would we create that God's going to fund somewhere else from some other place, and then trust him to do it? And when you see two or three of those things like we've already seen come to fruition, you go, wow, God can do this. He could really do this. Whereas, guys, if we hadn't created that second budget, we would just think, oh, that's nice of that church to want to help us, right? But it's not just nice of that. That was God motivating that church to do what we heard God tell us he wanted us to do. He will provide. And then when that all happens, then this is where it comes together, folks. This is where your people, they are taught, because they see it in their church. As God provides for my church, guess what? He'll provide for me. And I can begin to live in that kind of faith. And I can even give generously because I know God will be generous to me. So you create a culture of generosity in your church. One of the reasons we don't have a culture of generosity in our churches among people is our churches live rather stingily. We act like God is on a short budget and can't fund anything. And then we wonder why our people are stingy and not generous. And so we need to be generous as church members because we need to be generous as a church. All right. All right. Thank you very much for all those long stories I just told. Anybody got any questions or any longer stories? Probably nobody has any.